Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Today is Good Friday, and as we continue to consider some of the smaller characters in the events of Holy Week, today we are going to look at two characters who came into the story on the first Good Friday when Jesus died. We want to look at Simon of Cyrene and Joseph of Arimathea. You've probably heard of Simon of Cyrene. He was the person who the Romans made carry Jesus' cross on the way to the site of the crucifixion. He seems to have been a passerby who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or as we may see, perhaps he was at the right place at the right time. The first question we need to ask is, why did anyone need to carry the cross for Jesus? It was normal in those days to have the condemned man carry his own crossbeam to be attached to the vertical poles that were already at the execution site. But in this case, we need to remember that Jesus had already received a flogging. This was done with a whip with little pieces of metal near the end to gouge the flesh. Usually a person was flogged as punishment and then released. Jesus was flogged and then condemned to die. So after the flogging, he was in such a weakened condition from pain and blood loss that he needed assistance to carry the cross. So Simon was compelled by the soldiers to carry it for him. Cyrene was on the northern coast of Africa, near the eastern part where Libya is today. There is much speculation about Simon. There was a large settlement of Jews there. Was Simon part of that? Or was he a pagan who just happened to be there in Jerusalem? And as we have asked with others this week, how did his participation in the death of Jesus affect him? Interestingly, we have a clue here. Later in Acts, his two children, Rufus and Alexander, are mentioned as being part of the early church. So it appears that carrying the cross of Jesus so affected Simon that he became a believer and passed the faith on to his children. The Roman soldiers didn't intend it this way, but what a privilege for Simon to be the one to render this service to his Lord and Savior. Finally, for this week, we want to look at Joseph of Arimathea. Here's what the Bible tells us about him. He seems to have been a rich man, but more importantly, he seems to have been a member of the council that voted to put Jesus to death. Yet the council writers are clear to indicate that Joseph had not agreed to their plan for Jesus. In other words, he was a secret follower of Jesus. However, he somehow screwed up his courage, and after Jesus died, went to Pilate and asked for the body so that he could bury it. Pilate granted it, and Joseph bought spices and a shroud for the body and buried it in his own tomb. That's where things get really interesting. You see, by touching a dead body, Joseph would have rendered himself unclean and therefore wouldn't have been able to celebrate the Passover holiday with his family. For Joseph, doing the right thing for Jesus was more important than his own celebration. Perhaps he knew he was participating in God's new path of salvation for God's people. Another really interesting thing is that Joseph didn't do this alone. He had a helper, a man named Nicodemus. You might remember Nicodemus. He was the Pharisee who came to Jesus at night so he wouldn't be seen, and then discussed matters of faith with Jesus. That discussion led to the famous verse, John 3:16, about God loving the world so much that he sent Jesus that we might have life. There's been much speculation about Nicodemus's involvement here. Did that discussion he had with Jesus lead Nicodemus to faith? Another interesting observation is that there were some Pharisees who believed in Jesus, even if it was in secret. We tend to have the view that it was Jesus on one side and all the Pharisees on the other. But Joseph and perhaps Nicodemus show us that it wasn't that clear-cut. There were perhaps two, and perhaps even more, who appreciated and followed Jesus. Today, Jesus makes his way to the cross. May we follow him there. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.